The war that erupted in Ukraine in February 2022 did not begin overnight. Its roots run deep, tangled in centuries of shared and often painful history between two nations. To truly grasp the current conflict, we must look back to the moment the Soviet Union crumbled. In 1991, Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for independence, finally stepping out from Moscow's long shadow to forge its own path. This was a moment of immense national pride and hope. However, independence did not erase the complex ties that bound Ukraine to Russia. Cultural connections, family bonds, and critical economic dependencies, especially in energy, meant that the two countries would remain deeply intertwined for years to come, a relationship that was both a source of stability and a seed of future conflict. For many in Russia, Ukraine's independence was a difficult pill to swallow. They viewed Ukraine not just as a neighbor, but as a little brother, an integral part of their own historical and cultural world. The shared heritage, originating in the medieval state of Kievan Rus', fueled a narrative in Moscow that Ukrainians and Russians were one people. This perspective often ignored Ukraine's distinct language, culture, and its long struggle for sovereignty. For Ukraine, the challenge was immense: how to build a modern, independent state while managing a relationship with a much larger and more powerful neighbor that often questioned its very right to exist as a separate nation. This fundamental disagreement over history and identity would become a persistent source of tension. The new nation of Ukraine was itself a country of contrasts. The western regions, which had spent parts of their history under Polish or Austro-Hungarian rule, were predominantly Ukrainian-speaking and looked toward Europe for their future. They were often the engine of nationalistic sentiment. In contrast, the eastern and southern regions had stronger historical and cultural ties to Russia. They were home to large Russian-speaking populations and industries that were deeply integrated with the Russian economy. This internal east-west divide was not just a matter of culture or language, it became a significant political fault line, influencing election results and national policy for decades and making the country vulnerable to external pressure from Moscow. This delicate balance defined Ukraine's first 2 decades of independence. The country's leaders had to perform a constant political tightrope act. They needed to satisfy the aspirations of a population that wanted closer ties with the West, while also avoiding provoking their powerful neighbor to the east. Russia, for its part, used its leverage, particularly its control over natural gas supplies, to influence Ukrainian politics and keep it within its sphere of influence. This tug-of-war created a volatile political environment. It was a fragile peace, one that depended on a careful equilibrium that, as events would later prove, could be shattered by popular uprisings and geopolitical shifts, pulling the two nations toward a path of confrontation. In 2004, the fragile political balance in Ukraine was put to a dramatic test. A presidential election was held to replace the outgoing leader. The two main candidates represented the country's deep divisions. Viktor Yanukovych was openly pro-Russian and had the backing of Moscow. His opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, championed a pro-Western agenda, advocating for closer ties with Europe and NATO. When the official results declared Yanukovych the winner, allegations of widespread fraud immediately surfaced. International observers cited evidence of ballot stuffing and voter intimidation. For many Ukrainians, particularly in the central and western parts of the country, this was an unacceptable theft of their democratic voice and a blatant move to pull Ukraine back into Russia's orbit. What followed was a remarkable display of peaceful, popular resistance known as the Orange Revolution. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians poured into Kiev's Independence Square, which is called the Maidan. They wore orange, the color of Yushchenko's campaign, and set up a massive tent city, braving the freezing winter weather for weeks. Their demand was simple: they wanted a fair vote. The protests were peaceful but relentless, capturing the world's attention. The sheer scale and determination of the crowds put immense pressure on the ruling establishment. The West, including the United States and European nations, voiced strong support for the protesters' democratic rights, a stance that was viewed in Moscow as direct interference in its backyard. The pressure worked. The Ukrainian Supreme Court ultimately annulled the fraudulent election results and ordered a revote. In the new election, held under intense international scrutiny, the pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko won a decisive victory. It was a monumental moment for Ukrainian civil society. The Orange Revolution demonstrated that the Ukrainian people had the power to shape their own destiny and hold their leaders accountable. For Russia, however, it was a major geopolitical setback. They had lost a key ally and watched as Ukraine took a significant step away from Russian influence and toward the West. The event left a lasting sense of bitterness in the Kremlin. The long-term impact of the Orange Revolution was complex. While it was a victory for democracy, the subsequent years were marked by political infighting and gridlock among the pro-Western leaders, which stalled crucial reforms and led to public disillusionment. This political instability allowed pro-Russian forces to regroup. In a twist of fate, the same Viktor Yanukovych who was ousted by the protests would go on to win the presidency in 2010, in an election that international observers deemed largely free and fair. His victory highlighted the persistent East-West divide in the country. Yet, the precedent had been set. When faced with a government they believed was betraying their national interests, the Ukrainian people were willing to take to the streets. The next major turning point arrived in late 2013. President Viktor Yanukovych, who had campaigned on a promise to sign a major association agreement with the European Union, abruptly reversed course. Under intense pressure from Moscow, which offered a $15 billion bailout package, he refused to sign the deal. For many Ukrainians, this felt like a profound betrayal. It was a rejection of a European future in favor of renewed subservience to Russia. This decision ignited a new wave of protests, far larger and more consequential than the Orange Revolution. Once again, Ukrainians flooded Kiev's Independence Square in what became known as the Euromaidan, or Revolution of Dignity. What started as a pro-EU demonstration quickly evolved into a broader movement against government corruption and Russian interference. The protests lasted for 3 brutal winter months. The government's response grew increasingly violent. Riot police used tear gas, rubber bullets, and eventually live ammunition against the demonstrators. The protests culminated in February 2014, when dozens of protesters were killed by snipers in the heart of Kyiv. The bloodshed shocked the nation and the world, causing Yanukovych's political support to collapse completely. Seeing that he had lost control of the country and his own security forces, he fled to Russia. A new pro-Western interim government was quickly formed in Kyiv. For the protesters, it was a hard-won victory. But for Russia, the overthrow of a democratically elected pro-Russian president was viewed as a hostile, Western-backed coup d'état on its doorstep. Russia's response was swift and decisive. It claimed its actions were necessary to protect the ethnic Russian population and its strategic military interests. In late February 2014, unmarked Russian special forces, the so-called Little Green Men, seized control of government buildings and military bases across Ukraine's Crimean peninsula. Crimea, home to Russia's vital Black Sea Fleet, has a majority ethnic Russian population. Moscow quickly organized a referendum on joining Russia, a vote that was held under military occupation and was condemned as illegal by Ukraine and the international community. The predictable result was an overwhelming vote in favor, and in March 2014, Russia formally annexed Crimea, redrawing the map of Europe by force for the first time since World War II. Simultaneously, a new conflict erupted in Ukraine's eastern industrial heartland, the Donbas region, which includes the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. With covert support from Russia, including weapons, funding, and military operatives, local separatist groups declared independent people's republics. They seized government buildings and fought against Ukrainian forces, igniting a brutal war. Russia denied its direct involvement, insisting it was a civil war, but the evidence of its role was overwhelming. This conflict in the Donbas would grind on for 8 years, long before the 2022 invasion. It claimed over 14,000 lives, displaced millions, and left Ukraine in a permanent state of war, fighting to preserve its territorial integrity against a Russian-backed insurgency. A central element in this escalating crisis has always been the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Formed after World War II as a defensive military alliance to counter the Soviet Union, NATO's purpose became, well, a lot less clear after the Cold War ended. However, in the late 1990s and 2000s, the alliance began expanding eastward, admitting former Soviet bloc countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states. For these newly independent nations, joining NATO represented an ironclad security guarantee against any potential future aggression from Russia. They saw it as a final break from decades of Moscow's domination, and a firm anchor to the West. From Russia's perspective, though, this eastward expansion was seen as a betrayal and a direct threat. Russian leaders claimed they had received verbal assurances from Western officials in the early 1990s that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. While the existence of a formal promise is debated, there's really no doubt that Russia viewed NATO's growth as an aggressive move that brought a hostile military alliance right up to its borders. The Kremlin saw NATO not as a defensive body, but as a tool of American power designed to encircle and contain Russia. This feeling was intensified by NATO's military intervention in Kosovo in 1999 without UN approval, which Russia saw as a dangerous precedent for ignoring national sovereignty. The issue came to a head at a NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008. The alliance formally declared that Ukraine and Georgia, another former Soviet republic, will become members of NATO. While no timeline or clear path to membership was offered, the declaration itself was, honestly, a bombshell for Moscow. Top American diplomats had warned for years that offering Ukraine NATO membership was the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite. For the Kremlin, the idea of Ukraine, a country they considered historically and culturally fraternal, joining a rival military alliance was simply unacceptable. They saw it as a potential staging ground for Western forces and a final humiliating loss of their influence in the region. After the 2014 revolution and Russia's annexation of Crimea, Ukraine enshrined the goal of NATO membership in its constitution, making its Western trajectory official policy. In response, the United States and other NATO allies dramatically increased their military support for Ukraine. They sent trainers, provided advanced weaponry like anti-tank missiles, conducted joint military exercises, and helped modernize Ukraine's armed forces. While Ukraine was not a formal member of NATO, it was becoming a de facto military partner. For Russia, this was the nightmare scenario realized. A hostile Western armed military was being built on its border. This growing military cooperation convinced Moscow that it had to act decisively to stop Ukraine from ever formally joining the alliance. The simmering conflict in Donbas and the standoff over NATO set the stage for the final escalation. Throughout 2021, Russia began a massive and honestly, pretty ominous buildup of military forces along Ukraine's borders. Tens, and then hundreds of thousands of troops along with tanks, artillery and missile systems were moved into positions in Russia and Belarus, effectively surrounding Ukraine from the north, east and south. The buildup was far too large for a typical military exercise, and Western intelligence agencies began warning that Russia was preparing for a full-scale invasion. The Kremlin initially dismissed these warnings as hysteria, claiming it had the right to move troops within its own territory. In late 2021, Russia issued a set of ultimatums to the United States and NATO. Its demands were sweeping. Moscow wanted a legally binding guarantee that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO. It also demanded that the alliance pull back its military forces and infrastructure from Eastern European countries that had joined after 1997, effectively asking NATO to rewind its expansion by a quarter century. For the West, these demands were non-starters. They argued that NATO has an open-door policy and that sovereign nations like Ukraine have the right to choose their own alliances. A frantic series of diplomatic talks through late 2021 and early 2022 failed to find any common ground, with both sides refusing to budge on their core principles. As diplomacy failed, Russia's rhetoric grew more heated. In a long televised address, President Vladimir Putin laid out a distorted historical argument, claiming that modern Ukraine was an artificial creation of Soviet Russia and had no true history of statehood. He accused Ukraine of committing genocide against Russian speakers in the Donbas, a claim for which there was no evidence, and described its pro-Western government as a neo-Nazi regime controlled by the West. This narrative was intended to dehumanize the Ukrainian leadership and justify military action to a domestic Russian audience. It signaled that Russia's goals went beyond just stopping NATO expansion to fundamentally challenging Ukraine's sovereignty. On February 24, 2022, those fears were realized. Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Moments later, Russian missiles struck targets across the country, and ground forces invaded from multiple directions, including an advance toward the capital, Kyiv. The full-scale war had begun. The conflict is the culmination of decades of unresolved historical grievances, Russia's imperial ambitions, its deep-seated fear of NATO, and Ukraine's determined, unyielding struggle to exist as a sovereign, independent, and European nation. These powerful opposing forces created a collision course that diplomacy could not avert, resulting in the largest and most devastating war in Europe since 1945.